2025 meeting of the Strategy and Resources Committee. You have to excuse me as I have a bit of a cough, but don't worry, it's not anything contagious. So, first of all, agenda item 1 is to welcome everybody to this meeting. Welcome the members of the committee, and just to remind members and officers and members of the public that this meeting is being webcast. We're not expecting any fire alarm, so if the fire alarm does go, it's the real thing. So please, however, calmly leave the building via the front door, the lobby. Turn right when you get to the ramp and make your way to the front of the cathedral to be signed off by a fire officer. Okay, before I move on to agenda item 2, just quickly introduce myself. My name is Councillor Tony Dyer. I am the Chair of the Strategy and Resources Committee. To my left is Councillor Caroline Gooch, who is the Vice Chair of the Strategy and Resources Committee, and I'll introduce other councillors as and when they come to speak. Moving on to agenda item 2, apologies for absence and substitutions. I believe we have had apologies from Councillor King and Councillor Reynolds is substituting. Are there any other apologies or substitutions? I'm aware of Councillor Mallet that there may be a situation where you may have to leave, so I'm aware of that. Agenda item number 4 is the minutes of the previous meeting.
Chair, have you missed 3? Declarations of interest.
Agenda item number 3, declarations of interest. So I'd like to ask committee members if they have any interest to declare in relation to the items of business on the agenda. Okay, thank you. And thanks, Tim. I don't know how I skipped that one. So agenda item number 4, minutes of the previous meeting. Does any committee member have any changes or observations about the minutes? Therefore, I'd like to move that the minutes of the meeting of the Strategy and Resources Policy Committee held on the 20th of January are a correct record. Can I ask for a seconder, please?
Seconded.
Thank you. All those in favour of the minutes being adopted, please raise your hands. That's passed unanimously. Thank you. Agenda item number 5 is Chair's announcements. As we have some 1,300 pages of documents in front of us, I have no Chair's announcements. I just wish you all the very best of luck. Agenda item number 6 is public forum. We have public questions from Richard Coates. Richard Coates, are you available? And then we also have questions from Dan Ackroyd. I can't see Dan in the other building either. Okay, so if we move on to public statements, there are several public statements. I'll call them out one by one to see if anybody's here. Dr. Evan Jones, Professor Steve Poole, Tris Mensah, Buster Unison, Richard Jones, Kathleen Thompson, Jeff Gardner, Jeremy Clark, Rachel Beanie, Rose Wallace, Professor Lewis Bibbins, and the last one I know is here because I just heard him on his phone, David Wedgelow. David, would you like to make your statement, please?
I'm trying to do 2 things, talk to Wecker at the same time. So what I was going to say is obviously it was pleasing to see that the transport levy is being raised, first time in 5 years for the 3 unitary authorities in North Somerset to the West Riding Combined Authority. But obviously funding the combined authority to maintain public transport is very important until we get a precepting arrangement for the West Riding Combined Authority and the Mayor. We will be in this situation. Obviously, whilst we still have a best value notice, bringing in North Somerset and changing the rules at the West Riding Combined Authority is very difficult indeed. And I stress the importance of bringing WECA out of special measures. The other point I want to make is obviously we do seem to have a lot of duplication between the City Council, where reports go to Transport and Connectivity Committee only to be sent across to WECA for another approval system, something I think the Best Value Review is looking at. But I do remind everybody that, of course, the ultimate game is to, or goal rather, is to make WECA work as a transport authority, and as Mayor Rees tried to, another is actually transfer the staff that do the duplication across to WECA. So to look at budget savings, you won't do it this year, Tony, but you might be next year to start to move some of that resource, finance and money across to the combined authority, bus stops, infrastructure. We've got duplication of officers that go and do the same job, and I watch it with interest. It's not happening anywhere in any other combined authority in the country. So when we're looking for savings, I think what we do between the combined authority and Bristol City Council is something that John, the director, needs to have a good look at, and the duplication of effort and services is costing the authority a lot of money. But I do welcome the changes. I do welcome the 3 new bus routes and the work that's been done by Tim and Ed on doing that. East Bristol, North Bristol and South Bristol. I just flagged something else. So as fast as you do that and the hard work, first group then remove more services. We've got issues where the number 50 between Stapleton and French and Bristol has gone to an hour from April. The service to Oldbury Court for disabled people has gone to an hour. And obviously we still have this issue of not being able to get around East Bristol and across to Parkway Station in UWE, which affects residents in Kingswood and that area and Hillfields. So I welcome the work, but we've still got to stabilise the bus network, and also we need to look at how we work with them also on rail services. So welcome the work. Pleased with me progress on the levy. Thank you very much, Tony. I think there's a lot more work to do at WECA and a lot more staff to move over yet. We're not, and of course the other thing is when we grow, do we bring in Gloucestershire and Swindon? Because it has to grow. It's the smallest combined authority in a city region in the country. And I think that's something that should concentrate all the leaders' minds on this council. Because obviously the combined authority, the metro mayors, where all the big money is going to be in the future. Thank you, Tony.
Okay, thank you, David. All of the questions and statements were distributed to members of the committee, and written responses were provided to the questions as well. We'll now move on to agenda item number 7, which is the report of the Finance Subcommittee. The Finance Subcommittee is a standing established subcommittee of the Strategy and Resources Committee. Since late last summer and on through the autumn, the subcommittee held a series of meetings where members were briefed about the ongoing actions to mitigate the Council's budget challenge. The development of the budget consultation was carried out over November, December, and on the development of the emerging saving options. This activity culminated in a 2-part in-public meeting of the subcommittee held over the 15th and 16th of January, where members gave detailed consideration to and commented and raised questions with policy committee chairs about the draft savings options across each individual policy committee's remit. Feedback from the Finance Subcommittee, as per their report, has been taken into account in terms of the budget reports that we are considering today. And I would like to thank the subcommittee for their efforts. I would now like to invite Councillor Abdul Malik, Chair of the Finance Subcommittee, to present his report.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try not to repeat some of the stuff that you've gone over already, but as Chair of the Finance Subcommittee, it's my privilege to present our report on the draft budget savings proposals and options for 25-26. This document represents months, as you say, of diligent work and rigorous analysis and honest conversations about the financial challenges we face as a council and the communities that we serve. At the heart of our discussion was the one unshakable principle, Chair, how to balance fiscal responsibility with our moral duty to protect the most vulnerable in our city. We are fully aware of the scale of the financial pressures facing Bristol, with a projected £51.6 million funding gap that demands difficult decisions. Yet, as a committee, we were determined to ensure that every pound saved and every pound spent would reflect fairness, equity and commitment to minimising harm to the most deprived communities. We scrutinised each proposal in detail, asking tough questions and holding ourselves accountable to the residents of this great city. We examined the potential impact of changes to waste collection, library services, adult social care, and the support for low-income households, to mention a few. And for each area, we looked beyond numbers to understand how these decisions will affect real lives. Children walking to school, families struggling with the cost of living, and our elderly residents relying on care services. Chair, the report is attached to today's Strategy and Resources paper bundle for our consideration and ultimately our final approval, but I'd like to say a few words in presenting it to you. Within the report, we have highlighted areas where we found consensus and areas where more work is needed to address risks and inequalities. For example, on changes to the waste collections, we stress the importance of communication and support for larger households, ensuring no one is unfairly disadvantaged. On libraries, we explored the opportunities to modernise and improve services whilst protecting access for communities that rely on them as safe spaces. On adult social care, we emphasise the need for robust partnerships with health services to ensure fair funding and to ensure that the continuity of essential care for vulnerable residents. We also focused on the broader implications of our saving proposals, urging that equality impact assessments go beyond just compliance to truly understand how decisions will affect Bristol's diverse communities. Older people, disabled residents and those living in deprived wards are often disproportionately impacted by financial cuts, and we cannot lose sight of that reality. Throughout this process, Chair, I've been inspired by the collaborative spirit of the committee. Our work was strengthened by the insights of policy committee chairs, council officers, both past and present, and members of the public who participated in our sessions. Their contributions ensured that our deliberations were thorough and reflective of the concerns and aspirations of Bristol's residents. We do not present this proposal and the proposed report lightly, Chair. Each recommendation has been carefully weighed, and where there were differences of opinions, we've been transparent. What remains clear is our collective commitment to finding solutions that enable the Council to live within its means, whilst safeguarding the services and support for the most vulnerable residents and what they rely on. I note and welcome that since our meetings, our comments have been listened to and a number of changes have been made to the budget proposals that are before the Strategy and Resources Committee today. For example, our collective views on the budget options in relation to school crossing patrols, disabled parking bays, the library reviews, museums and cultural investment programmes have been fully taken into account, Chair. I want to take this moment to acknowledge the finance officers whose expertise and dedication supported us through the process. I also want to thank my colleagues on the finance subgroup committee for their hard work, scrutiny and passion. Together we've approached this challenge not simply as a budget exercise, but as a moral responsibility. As the report moves to Strategy and Resources Committee, I urge us all to approach these discussions with the same care and diligence, but also, the stuff that defines our work. Bristol deserves nothing less, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Malik. I'm going to open up for questions or comments from any other member. Councillor Blenkinsop.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Malik, for your work and the work of the Finance Subcommittee, and it's good to hear that we have perhaps rowed back on some of the more objectionable content. I had a couple of clarifying questions that I hope you'd be able to answer, and then one which I think is a little bit more weighty. So I'm clarifying, looking at point 3 on page 19 with regards to looking at the budget process and how that's been, the effectiveness being reviewed. Will that also be feeding into the committee model review group, or is that just going to be a purely internal finance subcommittee consideration?
As a member of both of those groups and having discussed it last week, if I can take that one, there was a suggestion, actually I should look at, there will be the review in the finance subgroup, but there was a suggestion that a report could go from that to the committee model review group rather than another group that wasn't on that group trying to discuss the whole process. A report goes from one to the other.
That seems very sensible, so glad to hear. The other one, the clarifying question on page 26 on supported accommodation. Members further noted the comment from officers that some Bristol supported accommodation schemes appeared to be expensive compared to peers. A little bit more clarity on why that is would be welcome, I think. Why were we substantially more expensive?
From the councillor, took me unawares there. We've certainly been reviewing the processes within the temporary accommodation area over the last year, as I think you know, and we've been reviewing all of the aspects of it. The review that we carried out into the process has suggested some changes into how we do that. So that is something we're in the process of implementing at the moment. So the extent to which we're in outline that is something we're hoping to address.
Okay, so presumably that will be coming forward with some more data once those
yes,
conditions are... Okay.
The regular work on that is reported to the Homes and Housing Delivery Committee.
Good. The other point on page 22 with regards to the future of Bristol's library service, now I'm sure we can come back to that later, although I know it has been deferred for this year. My concern regarding this is this would inevitably involve a reduction in the number of libraries, but an improved overall and more comprehensive service to residents. I'm curious as to, how do I put this, that while I appreciate there are a number of libraries that are struggling, I wonder what metrics will be used to determine which libraries in particular will be closed. And I say this because I remember Councillor Williams' comments with regards to the usage of libraries in Henleys as opposed to libraries in Avonmouth and Shirehampton. I believe it would be a mistake to judge this purely based on usage numbers and not on, for example, the need in the surrounding areas, whether or not there are children who have access to quiet spaces, who have access to books. So I wanted to know by what criteria, if that had been considered, this reduction would take into account.
I think, Tom, one of the reasons why we took in the information that was come back and the queries are coming back was to give ourselves more time to explore specifically that type of information. I think there was the feeling that we needed to have that, build in that extra bit of time to identify as part of that cross-party group that would be looking after the future of the libraries, is what do we as a council and as members of that council consider to be the key criteria by which we measure the importance of libraries? Because as I think if you talk to different people who each have some different criteria, what we need to do is find out what is the criteria that we can most agree on as being the most important. And I think the other side of that as well is what Stephen was commenting on was in terms of what budget may be available from the council. I think one of the other things we're looking at is what may be the other sources of income that we can use to help, if possibly even expand what our library service has, which is why we're looking at what has been done in some other cities like Sheffield, for example.
I mean, it's good to hear, and I'm glad that we can have these conversations and perhaps work together on that. But so in some ways, that answer is very reassuring. In other ways, that answer is not very reassuring because that means we still do not know which libraries may be at risk and where we're going to be directing our attention. Everything is still very much up in the air. So you can understand my concern. But I appreciate your point, and it does sound like we can make some positive progress.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Tom, and what I'll also say, I think we've been in that situation for quite a long time, where people have been unsure about the certain future of their libraries. I think whatever we do, we need to come out with something that does provide certainty for longer length of time. As you'd be well aware, there are some libraries where it's hard to know when that library is going to be open until sometimes you get to the door. But thank you, I do take your point on board. Councillor Rippington.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions, but given the public forum was so short, that hopefully, you'll allow me to get them all in by the end of the meeting. Just before I ask my questions, just drawing attention to the very limited public forum for the most important strategy and resources meeting of the year. These meetings were supposed to be making everything more transparent and encouraging community involvement. So I think we'll all agree it's pretty disappointing to see the limited engagement and the pretty empty public gallery, which it has been for most of these meetings throughout the year. Apart from Nigel there. Hello, Nigel. Even Dan hasn't turned up for this one, I have to say. So questions. First question is about the Finance Subcommittee itself. It has no decision-making powers, so their role was essentially to comment and make observations on proposals, which sounds to me like the Finance Subcommittee is essentially a scrutiny committee, the same as the Resources Scrutiny Committee that I used to sit on, Task and Finish Group. Under the mayoral system, we had a deputy mayor with specific responsibility for overseeing the council's finances and giving political direction. So it appears that we no longer have that role within the council. I appreciate that you've got the role as chair of strategy and resources, but you are the leader of the council as well. So it feels to me like there's a bit of a hole there in terms of really being able to give some political focus to the finance consideration. I'm wondering if anybody'd like to comment on that.
I would say it's a question of interpretation. Personally, I think that the leader of the council, whether they be the leader of the council or whether be the mayor, should take much careful and close consideration of the council's finances. I think in the end, whether you're a mayor or whether you're the leader, in the end, the buck stops with you. You're the ones that have to take responsibility, and you should be much closely looking at what is happening within the finances of the council. What I will also say is that all of us on the finance, on the Strategy and Resources Committee have had reports come to us on a regular basis. We've all had the opportunity to review those papers, so we all have an interest. It's not just myself. I also have the backing of a very good team of officers as well to support me on that as well. In terms of whether that's adequate or whether that's good enough, that's probably more a question perhaps for the committee model review group rather than for this particular session. I'm here to deal with the strategy and resources recommendations to full council. I'm not here to change the way that this committee model operates.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can put that on the agenda then for the committee that I'm not actually on. But yeah. Second question, in relation to waste collection. Just reading that modelling on waste collection seems to have focused heavily on one of the options in the consultation, which rather sounds like the results of the consultation have been prejudged somewhat. I was just wondering if there's a comment on that.
I can reassure you that there haven't been no prejudgments made. We'll await the outcomes of the consultation. I believe it has had a very large number of responses. Perhaps your comment earlier about lack of public engagement is probably people now feel more confident that they can engage in consultations, and that they maybe do not need to have to make the trek all the way down into City Hall to be heard. But no, there has no predetermination has been made. The consultation, I believe, finishes on March the 10th. We'll then listen to that and make a decision based on the results of that consultation. Otherwise, there'll be no point doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Third question for now. I think you said I can have 3 on this round. Children and young people. It says in the report whether further investment should be planned for future years, i.e. beyond the current planned investment, and whether an opportunity was potentially being missed around this was a question that was asked in the meeting about children's homes, provision of children's homes. And the answer was it was noted that the service had reasonable confidence that the current planned investment in children's homes was at the right level and was feasible in terms of delivery. So I'm taking that to mean that the answer to the question was no, that there is no opportunity being missed for more investment than is currently planned?
I think I may defer to Hannah to respond to that one.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I mean, I think we'll keep it under review. Last year's budget round added quite a significant amount of increased investment into children's homes. We've got 42 places now, children's homes across the city, 8 children's homes in total. We want to get the right balance between our own children's homes commissioning other places, particularly the sort of regulatory requirements on our own places are quite sort of stringent, so we want to get that right. So we have increased it significantly. I think we'll keep it under review whether we do need any more going forward. As you know, we're under significant pressure in terms of residential placements. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I mean, we are under significant pressure. Is it not the case that it's advantageous for us to be providing them ourselves rather than, you know, and that's why we're bringing, you know, creating more of them?
It is. But obviously the cost of having a significant number of places, empty places, we need to be able to both match the placements, the commissioning of placements with the places that we have, the cost of provision, the cost of staffing, the regulatory impression on us in terms of running our own children's homes. So we're wanting to get that balance. We've really significantly expanded what we're doing as it stands. And obviously, I mean, the whole strategy set out in our budget paper is all predicated on trying to keep children as far as possible safely at home. So we don't want to be assuming we're continuing to see high and rising numbers of children into placements as it is. Thanks.
I think it's also fair to say, Tim, that there are many things that we wish there were more investment for, because I think many of us in this room recognise that if we had more public investment, we can invest in more services that we could deliver ourselves, and that is why some of us are and will continue to lobby for additional funding for local government and other public services.
Yeah, I guess the point of my question was to find out whether we think we're doing what we need to do, or whether we're doing the maximum we can do with the level of investment that we have.
I have confidence in Anna and her team that they are doing the maximum they can within the budget restraints that we're facing. I mean, we are still having significant increases in whether you want to call it demand or need for these services, and Hannah and her team are working very hard to make sure we are resolving and providing those services to the best of our ability. I can assure you of that. Councillor Renard.
I think just staying with the children's services point, I think the point is, though, that the capital the payback on the revenue saving from investing that capital is significant and quick as well. I think we'd really encourage that to be looked at further. You know, part of the work of the last administration was to start to get Gorham Homes to be offering up properties as children's homes as part of their house building plans. And, you know, what we're doing to look at schemes like Dovercourt Road, New Fossway, and other schemes that are coming forward to maximise those opportunities. Because whilst absolutely we should take a prevention approach, avoid the need for children to go into homes in the first place, the reality is that demand is not going to reduce for some time, and obviously decoupling the property from the care package can produce significant savings, can't it? It's much easier. I know it's maybe a slightly different, it's much easier to change a care package if it's not suitable, if you're not reliant on the house that the provider is also providing, than the other way around. So it's more just an observation. I think, you know, I'd really encourage us and the Children and Young People's Committee to look at this further in the coming 12 months, because children's is the significant growth pressure, and you know, when we were talking about the 22 million figure earlier in the year, you know, 17.1 million of that or something like that was out of our children's placements largely, wasn't it, that's driving demand. So I think that's my just first point, more just an observation. I think secondly, I would say it's interesting, isn't it, because we've taken libraries out so that we can do that work through a task and finish group to look at what the future looks like and then revisit what will happen. But we've left the cuts to non-recyclable waste in. So, you know, forgive us for being a bit cynical about it. It can look like predetermination. And, you know, I welcome the level of engagement that's been with the consultation, but that's, I think, from what I've seen, because people aren't very happy with 4 weekly bin collections as a potential concept. But I think we we do need to be mindful of how these things can be perceived and played out. And actually, we've done one thing there with libraries, but we've left it in with bins. And what happens if the end result is to keep 2 weekly? You know, you've then got to go and find, was it 1.3 million or so? So, you know.
Yeah, I think I'll say in terms of, if we don't know what the outcome of the consultation is going to be, but the reality is some of the savings in this budget, as in previous budgets, do have that caveat that they are subject to consultation. What we try to do is where possible, is to ensure that where there is a potential budget cut immediately this year, that we have tried to defer that to provide time. Or the other side of this as well, of course, is that our waste services are delivered through an arm's length company. So we also have to work with them in terms of developing their business plan as well. So it adds a slightly bit more complexity, as you're well aware.
Thank you, Chair. So there's just one more observation I wanted to also make. I think just about the timing of Finance Subcommittee in terms of this year's process versus previous years. Obviously, the Finance Subcommittee meetings, when they were doing their scrutiny function, scrutiny came after the Cabinet meeting, and it was the full budget papers that they had access to, whereas this has taken place on the summary information. So I would argue quite strongly that it's been a lot less transparent this time in terms of access to that information. I appreciate it's been tight. We're in a new governance system, but I hope that could be taken on board for looking forward to future years, so that we can make sure that the scrutiny can be more of the detail in future years, because that allows us to then more constructively engage, as we don't have access to the same information as, you know, the Green and Lib Dem chairs of committees.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've already demonstrated is that we're happy to listen and to learn and to move forward. And I think Councillor Malik has already taken on board and made some recommendations moving forward. I don't think we'll ever have a perfect process. You'll be aware of concerns about how the previous system worked as well. But we can at least try to be as effective and transparent as we possibly can. Any more comments or questions? You got another 3, have you, Tim?
I do, Chair. Quick question on domestic abuse services. I'm not sure if there's somebody here who can answer this, but the paper says, in response to questions, members received assurance from the Director of Communities and Public Health that the non-filling of the vacant commissioning post would have no impact on current service delivery. I just wanted a bit of clarity on why we're holding a vacant post if it has no benefit for us.
Well, we no longer are. That's why it's been removed.
Sorry?
I think that's why it's been removed, hasn't it? Is because it's been established by the team that they can absorb the additional work.
So we think that it was a post that we shouldn't have been
I think
advertised?
It's difficult for me because it's not an area that I cover in, but I think, unfortunately, what we have had to face up after years of reduced funding for government, that often we've had situations where the number of staff available to fulfil particular services has been reduced and has been less than what was before. In some cases, that has created difficulties, and we've tried to address those. In other areas, there has been the ability for the officers to absorb the work within the smaller team. In this instance, we've been reassured by the team that they feel they are capable of absorbing the work. If that proves not to be the case, then we obviously would have to revisit that situation.
Thank you. I mean, I think the concern within our group really is that, as you say, because these services have been cut so much over the years, that if that money was in, you know, we're taking more money out of the budget one way or another, and perhaps that money could be used within that team to help provide what are pretty vital services on low budgets anyway.
I don't disagree, but also at the same time, we also have to set a balanced budget, so we do have to make some changes somewhere. And it is 40,000. I think the other 100,000 was a project that was halted in April before the election and is no longer, therefore, in the budget to begin with.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I've got a question on transport now. Increased parking charges with the new linear model. This was something that came to the Transport Committee back in September and was rejected by members, so it's a bit disappointing to see it coming back in the budget after members have sort of said that it's something they don't want to see. But it mentions the city's nighttime economy and planned discussions with people around that. We actually had that meeting last week with the Chair of Transport Committee and myself attended, and we did I asked the question what impact people thought this would have on their businesses, and the overwhelming feeling was that it would have a major impact on staff who are on a minimum wage, because effectively what this proposal is doing is doubling the amount that they would have to pay in car parking charges, and these people are already on very low wages anyway. So it's disappointing to see that this is still in there, and I hope that we can find a way to mitigate that problem especially for minimum wage staff in the nighttime economy, for whom, as we know at the moment, other ways of getting home, such as public transport, are almost invisible.
Thanks, Tim. What page on the Finance Subcommittee report was that on?
It's under Transport Savings, reference 2425.
Yes.
Page 24.
Thank you. Yeah, I found it. John, do you want to come in on this one?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. So, as you say, that proposal came to committee previously, didn't it? And there was discussion that the chair would, along with others, have discussions with the nighttime economy groups, which have been happening, as you said. And then the idea is that it would come back to committee for further discussion. So, as you know from other savings that we've had like this, if that proposal isn't then implemented, we'd have to look at some other savings within the committee. But it's not going to be implemented without coming back to committee, is my understanding, Councillor.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks, John. I do have one. Just under adult social care. This is a question. Savings reference 2425 AO13, strategic review of in-house services. Essentially, this is looking at more privatisation. And, I do feel that we should have learned by now that this often leads to less accountability and poorer services. So it's a really worrying one from our group's point of view, I think. And I just wanted to raise that in the recent Grant Thornton report to Audit Committee, it was noted, and this was in relation to child services, but I think it's equally relevant here. It's noted that the largest 15 private providers of children's care make an average of 23% profit. So, as I say, I know we're talking about adult social care, but the principles are the same. And we really, if we see that as a way of saving money, it will also inevitably be a way of our standards lowering to make that kind of profit and provide the same service. You have to cut corners, and that's what we're really worried about with this one.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think many of us have long had concerns about the use of private provision. It is something that has happened for quite a long time. I think part of the work that's been done here is to look at basically how we can ensure that those services are provided in a way that doesn't affect the level of service being provided, precisely because we believe there is room, precisely because of that, what you mentioned about the amount of profits being made. I think this doesn't just apply to adult services and children's services, but I think also elsewhere where we partner with organisations who often have or take away a higher level of profit than we probably think is suitable. So I think part of this area is to look at how we can ensure we get a fairer deal in terms of the services that are being provided. I think it's been recognised for a long time that in Bristol we have tended to pay over the odds for services when compared to other cities, and I think it's time we started to see what we can do to address that amount of money that we spend and look where we can actually have a better relationship with organisations, or ensure that we work with the ones that are willing to recognise that the council has serious financial considerations. Councillor Renard.
So I've just got one further question. It's off the back of something Tim was asking about. That's the linear parking model stuff. It's just an interesting governance question there, isn't it? So the policy committee has said, no, we don't want to proceed with this, yet it's appeared in the budget proposals anyway. Whether it's going back to the Transport Committee or not, I think is deeply problematic. And I came into that meeting to observe the back and forth, which could be described as clunky at best. But the bit I'm just interested in is who has signed off specifically that this proposal could go in this budget.
Well, it's a general point, Councillor, obviously, but it's been through the process that everything else has. So it's been to Finance Subcommittee, in private session, in public session, and come through in the papers to this.
Yeah, but it wasn't the Finance Subcommittee that signs off the budget pace. I think what I'm asking is, my understanding is you've had a series of leaders and chairs, senior manager away days, right, where you've discussed a lot of this detail with sort of the Green Liberal Democrat chairs. So the bit I just wanted to understand is the fact this has appeared in the budget proposals means someone somewhere went, yes, that can be included. And I was just interested to know exactly who that individual was politically. So I assume it would have gone to a politician.
Been involved in negotiations there. So there are negotiations with committee chairs and Tony as in leader. And specifically, my understanding when it went to committee was that there needed to be consultation with the nighttime economy before a decision was made. I pushed very hard to make sure that happened before the budget meeting, which is now happening, so that the proposals could be shaped. So it wasn't that it was flat out rejected, it was that specifically there needed to be more work on consultation with the nighttime economy people.
No, it was rejected. So who agreed for it to go back in the budget? Was it the chair of the Transport Committee? Was it yourself? Was it the lead? I just want to get some clarity.
Sorry, let me respond to that. In the end, ultimately, it's my decision about what goes into the recommendations for the budget. So if it's been rejected and it goes to transport and connectivity and they reject it again, then that would be me who have to do the mea culpa. Any more questions or comments? I'm looking at Tim intensely now. Right, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Malik, for presenting the report. And thank you for the questions and comments. This report is for noting. So what I would like to do is ask members to formally note the report from the Finance Subcommittee. Thank you. We now move up onto agenda item number 8, which is the Budget Report 2025-2026. I want to be clear to the committee that this report asks the committee to determine budget recommendations to the full council ahead of the 25th of February full council budget meeting. But to be clear, no final decisions are being taken today. The budget is for the full council to approve. I would now like to invite Andy Wavery, the Director of Finance, to introduce and outline the report. Andy.
Thank you, Chair. So the revenue budget and capital proposals start on page 30 to 992 of the pack. I think to note that we have two separate reports that we discussed after on the dedicated support grant and the housing revenue account. Now, Chair, I'm going to cover the headlines of the report and hopefully bring it together. So in terms of the draft budget proposal, this has been guided by the Council's medium-term financial strategy, but also informed by the in-year financial position of the Council. So as a result, the opening net budget has had around £75 million of investment for 25-26. This is partly to rebase budgets, accounting for the in-year spending levels across the Council, but also it's looked forwards in terms of building in assumptions around inflation and activity on services. So to give a bit of flavour, around 63 million, the majority of that investment has been allocated out to services. and around 15.8 million of that is across adults and communities, 26.1 million across children and education, and 17.3 across growth and regeneration. As the proposed increase in council tax of around 4.99%, with 2% of that being the social care precept, and the money we get from the government financial settlement has not covered the £75 million, there is a savings requirement. So new savings proposed of £42 million for next year. That gives us a net budget requirement for the council of £571.1 million. So more detail in terms of the savings proposals are in section 6.48 of the report, and full detail in appendix 8. The proposal sets out a balanced position for the next 2 years with more work to do in the final 3 years, and this will be informed by the government's comprehensive spending review. In terms of budget risk, a general earmark reserve has been provided of 34.2 million. So this has been increased in line with the increase in the net budget to maintain the 6% policy level that's applied in Bristol. A corporately held contingency for savings delivery risk of 4.3 million has also been provided. Just turning to capital, the council has an ambitious capital programme. When you look over the 5 to 10 year programme, it's £1.2 billion, with 763 million of this aligned to the HRA. Looking at next year's programme, it's £407 million, with 183 million aligned to the HRA, 120 million across growth and regeneration schemes, and 38 million across children's education. And there's more detail in section 13 of the report. Just turning to some of the final sections of the paper, and I think a really key one to note is my section 25 statement. So this is a legal requirement when it comes to budget setting for the council's 151 officer to look at the adequacy of council reserves and the robustness of estimates. And whilst this is week 5 for me, I've been fortunate to spend the prior 3 months to my start date working closely with the council's interim 151 officer and Sarah and the finance team. So I've had the fortunate position to put across, I guess, some of my insight into the budget, but also be assured on the numbers. I've seen the build-up of the budget and then the financial information that's come from the provisional settlement. So I am confident that the budget proposed is robust and there is an appropriate level of reserves. I think just finally, I would like to really thank colleagues as well in terms of the amount of work put into this. There's been a huge amount of work across the council's committees and the work of officers across the finance team and the services. So I think that really is probably one of my final comments, Chair. I think the other thing just to note as a key appendix in the report, it does include the Treasury Management Strategy. So this is a key document in terms of how the council handles its money. And there is a cautious approach being taken at the moment, given the fact that the Bank of England interest rate is maintaining at a high level and is continued to continue around the between the 4.5% to 5% mark in the future, and that does impact on council borrowing. So that is just something that we need to be mindful of when managing the council's money, that we're not taking out too much long-term debt. We're looking at servicing our debt in a short term and then looking at more beneficial rates in the future, and also making the most in terms of investment on council's cash balances.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
I'll now open up for questions. John.
Thank you, Chair. Can I also thank officers, and can you pass on our thanks to them for creating the budget report? It's a huge piece of work, and I know it takes a monumental amount of time each year. I just wanted to emphasise a point that the Chair has made, which is that what we're doing here is part of the process of allowing the budget report to move on to its next stage, which is the budget debate, which will be held on the 25th of February. And I would caution other members trying to have a debate about the budget itself at this particular meeting, because this isn't probably the right place for it. So for my part, I'll be voting quite happily to allow it to go on to the next stage, but just obviously put everybody on notice that doesn't mean that my group will be supporting this budget. In all likelihood, we will be bringing an amendment or a series of amendments to the budget, and if they are not accepted, we may or may not be willing to support the final budget. But I think as far as this stage of the proceedings is concerned, it's really to allow the next stage to go forward, and I think it would be very strange for us not to allow that to happen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, John, and appreciated. I think you are right, this is part of the process. However, at the same time, I think the committee members do want to ask some questions, and I'm willing to allow that. So, Councillor Blenkinsop.
Thank you, Chair. And I do take that point on that I'm sure there will be arguments we have around this. I do have some questions on a couple of specific points.
Debate, Tom. It'll be debate, not arguments.
I'm sure we do. I'm sure we'll have a nice, robust debate. But for page 97, so this is sort of talking around the reserves, accepting that we are not in the best of positions, and I know there is some conversation about the financing and the support from national government. But some of what we are proposing does seem quite actively detrimental to the long-term financial and social health of the city. So I want to ask whether or not there is an argument for dipping deeper into the reserves. I understand the point with regards to borrowing and how we need to be prudent, especially around the interest rates at the moment. But if there is a position that might allow us to be a little bit more aggressive with our reserves to avoid some of the nastier cuts, that's something that I'd be interested to know officers' thoughts on.
Yeah, apologies, Tom. I'm only smiling because I can see Councillor Heathermack, who's been down this track in previous. Okay. Andy, do you want to respond to Tom?
Yeah, I will respond. I take your point. When the reserves, when you look at them in isolation, look like large figures. They're one-off. So in terms of the recurrent nature, there is not a recurrent nature where the savings requirement is recurrent. So I guess the first point is, let's say a reserve allocation of 10 million was used to support the revenue budget and take down the savings requirement. Next year, it's kind of going to be 20 million because you're going to go up each year. And if you use reserves again, you're going to take the reserve down by 20 million. You get to year 5, you're 50 million down, and that's used almost a third of the earmarked reserves, or more than a third, actually. So it's not a strategy that I would support. I think sufficiency of reserves one year to the other, so keeping a core level of reserves is really important for Bristol. And being mindful that we don't go below a risk level, because that's where councils get into that territory of having to contact government for exceptional financial support, and that's something I really want to help steer Bristol away from.
Can I also just add, sorry Tom, because you may have had a question, is that one of the things we also have to look in the future is the resetting of the business rates. Do you want to briefly just explain what that's going to be like?
Okay, so at the moment, Bristol City Council, among others in the region, is in the the business rates retention pool. So we get the benefit of, once all business rates are collected, a tariff goes back to government, and that's a fixed amount, but then the amount above that tariff gets retained. So for Bristol, that's around £20 million. There's uncertainty going into 26-27 whether that amount will be retained or taken by government and put into a larger redistribution methodology. So that is something that's been recognised as a risk in the budget. So really important to have a reserve buffer that can deal with that in year one if that comes into play. So that's just a really important point.
That is a really important point, and thank you for clarifying on that, because that does indicate some of the difficulties here. Though I am still mindful of the fact that much has been made of the government funding or how much more is needed anyway. So if we're going to be making a lot of cuts and then asking for government help regardless, I'm a little bit bemused. But I'll draw on to something else, which is in terms of the generative AI pilot. And I'm open to AI in some respects, but I'm not sure that I would necessarily trust it, particularly around the propositions around it producing minutes and summarizing key points. At the moment, AI is not exactly reliable, and to paraphrase slightly, I'd prefer to rely on the slight risks around human intelligence than try and deal with all the myriad problems of artificial ones. I don't think the council is in a position to compete on the same level as Chinese and Californian tech bros, nor should we be. So I gently have to ask, why is this here?
I'm happy to take this question. I think the first thing is we've got to recognise it is a pilot. Similar. I have that sort of concern with AI in terms of it taking over the work where intelligent challenge is needed. But at the moment, the technology is moving fast. I think technology advancement in councils is really important. So taking out a pilot, I think, is a safe way to do it rather than saying rollout of AI across the whole council. I think that's the concern that you're raising. There are other councils, including the council that started at Derby City Council, that have been successful in utilising AI and building it into their customer interface, but it's got to be done in a contained way, so that's why there's a pilot being proposed in Bristol.
I certainly agree with doing a pilot rather than rolling it out flat out. Don't get me wrong on that, and I recognise that we are doing this in an intelligent and reasonably careful manner. My concern is that this is money that could be spent on other things which are of particular use. And I note, for example, the fairly deep cut on the Bristol Impact Fund, which has done a lot of work, a lot of really good work around the city. Measuring the impact of cutting 16% of it is probably going to be difficult, but it seems like it would do quite a lot of harm. And my concern is, I appreciate we'll probably discuss this at full council, an AI pilot when we could let others who are perhaps in the position to take some risks and go through that, or to work on fairly serious measures that have already proven their value, I would be inclined to go with the Impact Fund.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I think got Tim next.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm going to disagree with my Conservative colleague here at this point regarding our ability to ask questions about this budget. When we get to full council and the budget, we won't be having an informed discussion about what's useful and what's not. We'll be making speeches about what's in front of us. So I do find this really quite useful a period to ask exactly these sorts of questions. And I did have a question, but I've forgotten what it is. Sorry.
That's where artificial intelligence would be useful.
Following up on reserves. One point I did want to make is that we had our first discussions surrounding budget amendments with finance staff last Monday, and we, off the back of that, we asked quite a few questions which we still haven't had answers to, so I'm a bit concerned that we're kind of a bit behind the ball in terms of our understanding of bits of this budget. So I wanted to follow up on reserves in particular, and the £20 million figure. I wanted to check our understanding is that is £20 million that's coming out of reserves to help us fund services this year, or is it going the other way? Is it £20 million that we are putting into reserves?
Yeah. So this is a 20 million. It's back to the business rates of retention risk. So
right.
part of that reserve transfer is creating earmarked resilience reserve for business rates redistribution risk, and part of it's the already committed contribution to the dedicated support grant deficit, dedicated schools grant deficit.
Okay, so that was part of my next question, because elsewhere in the papers that we were shown last Monday, which I don't think I could find in here, was that in order to get to our 6% level for reserves, we needed to top up by about 1.3 million or something.
That's right, that's the last.
So that 1.3 million is part of the 20 million?
Yes.
But the vast majority of it is going into earmarked reserves?
That's correct.
Okay. And my final follow-up question on that is, how often do we review our earmarked reserves to make sure that actually they're still earmarked for things that we are very likely to need them for, and there aren't other other things that we might need to be earmarking reserves for, or things that we could take out?
Yeah. So setting the budget, reserves get reviewed annually, but I'll ask Sarah to come in also, because her team's more involved in the detailed work.
Yeah, so we review the reserves annually as part of the budget setting, but we also do take stock during the year. We review the need and assess those reserves as part of our periodic reviews through the year, and in fact reserves drawdowns and so on are reported back through the regular monthly monitoring to strategy and resources as well.
Any more? Councillor Bernard.
So I've got a few. First one, I just wanted to check in terms of what we're assuming around borrowing rates, that we follow in the Treasury assumptions, or we're using different assumptions, and if so, why?
Borrowing rates do change daily, but at the moment, sort of accessing the market for 1 year borrowing, you're looking at about 5.2%. It is going a little bit north of that because at this period, we're in the last 2 calendar years financial, of the financial period, councils tend to need more money at that point, so that is driving up interest rates.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I was interested in understanding further is around savings. So in previous years, the way that was done was kind of applying an optimism bias to the likely deliverability of savings. And the saving we put in was aligned with the optimism bias. So if we had 100% confidence, 100% of the saving went in. If it was amber, if it was red, I can't remember what the percentage was, like 1860 or something like that. But I think from our briefing that we had last Monday, we understand you're not doing it that way this time. So I'd be quite keen to just understand how you've worked that through, how much you've set aside in order to, if savings aren't achieved.
Yeah, just first taking the point on optimism bias, this is one of those areas with myself as the incoming 151 officer I fed into, that I prefer approach where we go through a thorough review of the actual savings proposed, because when you come up with savings, sometimes you have a sort of a high, medium and low approach, and I guess optimism bias is you kind of put in the high but then recognise you might not get to the high position, you might get to medium. My preference is to set on a figure that's deliverable but recognise as a timing risk, so the timing risk is recognised by the contingency, which is 10% on the 43 million of savings.
So you've got a 10% contingency built in. Okay, thank you. I think just
quickly coming on to that from this is probably a personal observation of my own. Bristol was almost unique in having optimism bias, and I think going back to my having a previous hat on where I worked with another organisation that did something similar, there is a danger that it can almost be given permission to fail to deliver the savings, which is why taking it back into a corporate area basically puts more emphasis on the service teams who actually deliver the saving.
That's helpful. It's just useful to understand these things, because obviously when we look at deliverability of savings next year, we're not comparing like for like, are we, in terms of that sort of deliverability measure. I do just want to come back to the point around questions and transparency. I appreciate everyone's working really hard, but some of the questions that we sent through, just finding my email, things like the financial model the HRO was first asked for on the 16th of January, the Bristol Waste stuff on the 22nd of January, and the majority of the questions was last Tuesday. We've had nothing. And it's very difficult for us to turn up to meetings here, having not had our questions answered in advance, of which there were, I appreciate, a substantial amount, for us to then engage in this process and support things to go through to the next stage. And obviously there's some learning points here for the future, but it has made it really challenging for us, because we think some of the stuff we were asking for we didn't think should take this long to provide, because we know it exists. So.
Yeah, just might ask Sarah to just come on that point. I'm conscious that the team are working hard to get the answers across to you, Councillor.
Yeah, we are working extremely hard to pull the responses together for you to get them back out to you as soon as possible. But if there's anything that you feel there's a gap, please do feel free to message me directly as well.
Yeah, if we could have the Bristol Waste budget for the last 5 years, that was the thing that was asked for on the 22nd of January, that'd be helpful. We really want to kind of make sure we can engage constructively in this process. What I would say is don't wait until you've got an answer for every single question.
No, we will
to send them back. Feel free to
you.
send them in chunks if you need to, rather than waiting, because it would help our engagement in this process and in the forthcoming amendments process, because you will want amendments turned around for next week. For us to be able to do that, we do need that information as soon as possible. So I really urge, can we have it as soon as possible, please?
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you.
The only thing I'll add to that is just be conscious that we have still only at the moment got the provisional financial settlement, so there may be the need to come back with some additional information once we get the final financial settlement, which I'm told is any time now, but we'll see. That's why it'd be so much nicer when we have multi-year settlements. Any other comments? Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just wanted to come back on the other point my colleague made over there, John, about the fact that we're just here to pass this paper on. I raised this at the agenda. I raised this at the agenda setting.
I don't think John quite meant it like that.
Well, I did raise this at the agenda setting meeting because I do think it has to be. We do need to understand what will happen in each of the scenarios that could happen. You know, at the moment we have a council that has a fairly, it doesn't have a majority, but very close to a majority, and therefore the likelihood of things happening is X. But, you know, under this system, we could end up with a system where half the council don't want to pass this paper at this point, and the other half do. So we need to understand what would happen in those circumstances. And I think you took that away from the last meeting. So I'm just wondering if you can clarify if this paper doesn't pass now, what actually would happen.
Thank you, Tim. It's almost as if we'd planned that in advance. Andy, what would be the potential consequences if we weren't to pass this through to full council?
Well, there's obviously the legal requirement of council tax settings. So, in terms of will be worked up for the full council paper is the council tax resolution for the council tax band amounts, and so the first issue is also for the precepting authorities. So, for police and fire, the ability for those authorities to set their budgets as well. So, that's why we have got a legal requirement to take the budget proposal through to full council, and that there is a requirement to really not go past the reserve date as well, so council tax setting, and also in terms of billing for our HRA tenants as well, so getting the HRA bills out as well. So, two core legal requirements, that is something that's set in law and is absolutely essential for us in terms of, servicing our citizens and providing council services. We need to be able to set a balanced budget.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the budget setting meetings, full council. I think I'm talking about what would happen if this paper wasn't approved today. Would it actually have any material difference to the budget setting process? Would there be a requirement to have another meeting to try and pass it, or would it just pass on to full council regardless of whether we'd approved it or not?
If nobody voted for it to go forward, then it wouldn't go forward. What that then does is then starts to build in delays in the timeline, in the time frame, in terms of, obviously, I would imagine that reasons would be given for why we weren't pushing it through or voting it through, and finance officers would have to respond to that. That would take them time to do that. So, we're now on the 4th of February, 20th of February is full council, budget full council. Papers have to be published for that a week ahead or so. So there are very tight deadlines. And it does go back to Tom's point earlier on about we do have to learn from the speed of the process, and hopefully we will learn lessons moving forward. But what I would say in our defence is not only have we moved to a new form of governance, we also had to cope with a general election in the middle of it as well, which also had some impacts as well. With some people having to work on that. But yeah, if it didn't go forward, then it would create considerably more work for the finance team to work on. But in the end, the decision you make has to be based on what you're comfortable with supporting. But no, I will defend John a moment. As John said, we're not making a decision about whether we approve of the budget that's being put forward. It's about whether we think that what's being proposed is ready to go for our colleagues at full council to debate and put amendments in. Councillor Renard.
Although one thing that's just worth clarifying is the recommendations that go to full council won't be the same, or will they this time? So they used to get a much longer set. When you went to cabinet, it was a much longer set of recommendations, because the stuff with the council housing earlier in the year was an argument over delegations, but that was what was in the cabinet delegations, not what was in the full council delegation. So for every single one of these recommendations on each of these 3 budget papers going to be voted on at full council as well. I guess is my just clarifying question.
So what you're raising is a constitutional point. So under the committee system, this is the gateway in terms of the content that then goes on to full council. So I'm not going to try and recite the Constitution right now, but Tim O'Gara is here also, and has been very close in that move. I think what you've touched on is a move from a cabinet system to a committee system. There's still a constitutional gateway that's specified, which is taking those papers through that system to then be ready for that full debate at full council.
Chair, I'm happy to add if it helps. So Andy's correct. The new governance arrangements require S&R to make that recommendation to full council. The vote at full council will be as in previous years, I'd anticipate. So we would have a number of block votes covering the different elements of the budget as we have done in previous years. We'll need to work through exactly how that's structured, but I don't envisage it looking that different to what we've had in previous budget meetings, where we split out the DSG and the HRA, etc.
Yeah, so it won't be the full set of recommendations on each of these papers. It'll be a truncated set then.
I'd imagine so, but we'll be reflecting on what it's looked like in previous years, and Andy will have his own views as to how those recommendations are ultimately presented for full council. But like I said, I don't anticipate it deviating too much from previous years.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I do have some serious questions continuing on about the budget, but I'm just going to say that this process does remind me a bit of the Tom and Jerry cartoon, where they're lying on the front of an engine, laying the track in front of them as they're going along, the way the committee system in general, and the way we're trying to figure things out as we go on. Absolutely. Back to the budget. So we've obviously got some questions about the general fund part, which we're on now, but also DSG and housing revenue account. So the one question that I think we asked that we'd like an answer, we asked our finance officer last week, but we'd really like an answer to now, is a number of proposals came forward in the draft budget that went to the finance subgroup. A number of things came out as a result of that meeting, were taken out. We're just wondering, where did the funding come from to enable those things to come out of the budget, given we were told initially that, they had to be in there in order to balance the budget?
Yeah. Firstly, in terms of the role of the finance subcommittee, it was a range of options. So there were more options in there than were required to actually completely balance the budget. So if every single option was taken forward in its entirety, there would have been an ability to almost self-manage, because there was you'd have overachieved your budget shortfall. So there was always an option there to look at that output of that group and then consider the things that got finalised and taken forwards. So that's the first point. And then secondly, I think in latter years, in terms of, Sarah might want to come in on the detail of this, but there has been reductions in terms of the corporately held contingency.
Yeah, so in terms of when we had the provisional settlement through, that was where we identified that there was an envelope, particularly in year one, where there was potentially some flex against those proposals that went through to finance subcommittee. And yeah, in year two, essentially, we've taken out all of the excess, any excess availability of contingency held corporately in order to manage that balance position into the second year.
I'll just take that though. In terms of the corporate contingency, it's fitting the savings contingency. So it's the 4.3 million for 43 million. There's not 43 million the following year, so it's that 10% principle that's been taken down. So that's what's created the ability to keep the budget in balance whilst considering the output of the finance subcommittee.
Councillor Goots.
Sorry, so I'm just trying to follow, but are we saying that basically everything that was put forward by officers at the beginning of this process was they went through and found everywhere we could possibly save some money and has put those forward knowing that we wouldn't have to take all of them forward, and then we've chosen what we want to take forward and what we haven't?
My understanding is there was officer work looking at more savings, and this was a list, but it was moving in line with the requirement to balance the budget in full, because if you go back to the financial strategy figures, it was a higher savings requirement, around 51.6 million. The provisional settlement was fortunate that those numbers moved a bit with the additional recovery grant that came through.
Also, I'll just add to that as well, is that we also had additional pressures identified as well. So it also went a little bit the other way as well. I think it was another £17.5 million of pressures something along those lines. So I think part of the situation we had was we were trying to identify as many savings as possible based on what we thought was going to be the likely gap. But because of a couple of things that have been mentioned, we ended up in a situation where we did have that little bit of leeway, which gave us that option to be able to listen to what the Finance Subcommittee and members of the public were saying about some of the proposals. If we hadn't been able to identify that gap, then we would have had to go forward with all the options that were available. Councillor Reynolds.
I just want to unpick this a bit so I can just understand it. 'Cause I mean, across the MTFP, you're talking north of 20 to 25 million pounds has been found to take out some of those things. Council tax reduction scheme was in there about 3.4 million a year from year two. Libraries, when the full saving was in from year 3, is 2 million a year. There's another 6, plus some of the other bits. That's quite significant sums of money to have suddenly found. So I just want to understand this a bit more about how that money's been found, and your contingency point I didn't quite follow. So if you wouldn't mind, just, sorry, re-explaining that as well.
Yeah. I'll just touch on the contingency point, and if Sarah's not got it to hand, she'll be able to provide you the detail on the rest. The contingency point was in 25-26, there's 43 million savings requirement, so 10% contingency applied for savings risks, that's 4.3 million. In 26-27, the savings requirement is 20 million pounds, so a corporately held contingency requirement of 2 million pounds, so that takes down the recurrent contingency requirement, because we're talking in recurrent budgets, because the 4.3 is recurrent, that's been taken down to the 2 million to match the savings requirement in 26-27. So that will release 2.3 million.
So you had a higher contingency for year 2 of the MTFP, and you've now reduced that to be 10%?
Yes.
Okay. How about the rest of the funds that have been found?
I suppose that's the point, that the year 3, 4, 5 don't balance at the present time, and we still need to do some further work to see how we can get those to balance. So that lack of balance has increased compared to where we would have been had those savings remained in.
Right. So in years 3, 4 and 5, we don't have a balanced MTFP, do we? 3, 4, 5, yeah. Sorry, what did I say? Sorry, 3, 4, 5 is what I meant. So we've taken some savings out, and we'll figure it out how we're going to bring that gap to 0.
So it didn't balance previously. What we're saying is by taking those savings out, that gap has grown compared to what it would have previously been. Yeah, so
things have been taken out and the identified savings has grown, which means that potentially the things that have been taken out might have to go back in.
Or other mechanisms to find a way to balance the funding.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just taking that point, because one thing I'm completely mindful of is from 26-27 going forward, so that's going to be informed by a 3-year comprehensive spending review.
Yeah,
so everything's going to be up for change basically from 26-27. Is just worth making that point.
I think what I also add, I've never been in this room where the members of the Labour group, particularly you, Tim, told me we should be more optimistic about what the Labour government are going to provide over the next rest of their parliament. So I'm taking your advice. We're being a bit more optimistic.
I've got one. Well, that's fine. I'm glad to see that there's recognition that the Labour government is improving the situation for local government finance. And just on that point, can you just clarify the total additional funding that this council is either receiving or can generate for the next financial year as a result of the provisional local government funding settlement?
Sorry, the total amount of additional funding?
Yeah.
I'll need to dig into a spreadsheet. If you've got another question, do you want to ask that? And I'll pull up the comprehensive spending spreadsheet.
Tim's got a question. Or you could do it in the percentage terms, I guess.
We want the figure rather than the core spending power percentage, if that's all right.
Tim?
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, so we did have the unusual situation here where we had several chairs of committees bringing forward proposals, which they then stood up and said, I do not back this proposal for savings. And I just wanted to clarify that it would have been those chairs could have said, I don't intend to take that proposal forward, that option forward, because it's something that I particularly disagree with. Just, this is something that would have happened under the previous cabinet, but in private, admittedly, not as transparent, but they would have been brought proposals that they said we're not willing to countenance that. These chairs could have, rather than standing up and saying, I'm bringing something forward, but I totally disagree with it, they could have just said, no, we won't take that forward. Could they not?
Potentially could have, but I imagine that, no, obviously cabinet decisions would have happened in private as well. I would imagine that, and I know from conversations I've had with former cabinet members that there were some decisions that were taken forward that they didn't agree with. But they recognised that there was a need to set a balanced budget. And that's the same with chairs going forward, is that there would be things that we all had things that we felt if we could find a way to avoid taking that forward, we would. But the overriding demand is we have a legal requirement to set a balanced budget. If we did not set that balanced budget, we would be in a similar situation to, for example, Birmingham, where you have commissioners coming in, you are basically asset stripping Birmingham, selling off for something like £1.25 billion worth of properties. So I would imagine whether it's policies and chairs or whether it's cabinet, there are discussions going forward, and I'll be very surprised if you were to get all your cabinet members together from the previous administration, whether they would tell you they were happy with every single saving that was put forward. Councillor Mack.
Yeah, from the very beginning of this list being presented and being early on shared with the finance subgroup, we committed that that list of everything, as Caroline pointed out, that came from officers would be shared with the finance subgroup, and then committed that that would go publicly. There's been an unfortunate trend of things that are shared in private briefings being leaked and getting into the public anyway, so we wanted to be clear of that transparency, that when we shared things with a group, first of all, in this case, to discuss behind doors, that it would then become public. So everything that I saw from the beginning of the process went into those public meetings. That doesn't mean that the committee chairs wanted those things to happen, but that is our commitment to transparency, which also, as I say, if the same information is being shared in those private meetings and being shared in the public meetings.
Tom B, then Tom R, and then I'm going to move on to the vote. Tom.
Oh, right. In that case, because is this that comes later? No, but I did have a bunch of questions about some of the later ones, and we've mostly been about Appendix 2A and so on. So is this a good time for that now, or?
We got 3 other papers, but they are specifically about the DSG, the HRA, and the P9 finance report.
Yeah.
So everything else, all the appendices. I mean, if it's about the DSG and HRA,
it's not about the DSG and HRA. It's more about some of the stuff that's in the equality impact assessment, for example. So, as an example, this is one of the smaller ones that I want to make a point of because I think it is something that needs to be raised. And it came up a few times. Where did I have it? Was in terms of more than a third of our LGBT staff have hidden their orientation, and I find that quite worrying because I'd like to think the council is quite an inclusive employer, it's quite an inclusive environment, and we're still in a position where more than a third feel they have to hide who they are. Perhaps that's something that we could take forward. I know that's not strictly a budget related matter, but something that we may want to bear in mind going forward, how we can perhaps strengthen our arrangements there, because I think that is a bit worrying. In terms of the disability, a lot of the cuts looking at the impact assessments seem like they will disproportionately hit older people and those with disabilities. I think that's fair to say. And I acknowledge our constraints that we have to do some amount of cuts around the care budget, but this seems incompatible with our approach towards making Bristol one of the more disability-friendly cities in the country. I appreciate we've got stuff that's being planned in further years. Do we have a plan towards mitigating some of the damage that these cuts will cause? Is that being developed? Will that be more of the adult social care's responsibility, or is that going to come back to strategy and resource in the future?
Thanks, Tom. I think in answer to the second question, obviously, it's very natural for us to look at the savings or cuts that are being made. There are also investments that are being made as well. and some of those investments would mitigate the impact of the cuts wherever possible. But often we do have a situation that where there is an increase in services, often the need for those services tend to be with those individuals who do come from probably who are likely to be more affected or more likely to be within those categories. I think I agree with you entirely about one of the things we do have to do as a council, and this is part of the path we're on, is to improve how we treat people from deprived communities, from minoritized communities, LGBT, right across the board, because it is something that this council in some areas hasn't necessarily been the best at. That's not a reflection on any administration. It goes back a long time. And I think all of us are familiar with the Runnymede report, for instance, which demonstrated that Bristol had some of the highest levels of racial inequality of any city. And I think all of us are aware of the fact that Bristol has both some of the least deprived areas in the city, almost cheap by Jarrow, with some of the most deprived areas in the country. And I think it's something that everybody in the chamber, not just us in this committee, are conscious of. And I'm certainly am, and I know that all of you on this committee are conscious as well. What we need to do is get ourselves in the position so we can address those inequalities more directly, and that's going to take time.
Thanks. That is absolutely true. Although I think there's something where we can work together, and that's something that we do care about, which is why I'm a little bit frustrated as well. So this is much later in the report, in the sort of 900 pages, but I was looking at some of the savings proposed. I know that some things will be going through consultation, but I feel that, and sort of echoing Councillor Mack's earlier comments of, cribbing from some of her speeches, I have concerns about the deliverability of some of these savings that have been put in. There's one example, we've got the employee vacancy review, and that's broken down into a vacancy saving, which is fair enough, but deleting roles, which doesn't seem like it would actually change anything in our finances, and 83,000 and from not having 2 full-time roles, and 62,000 in efficiency savings from that. That just, it seemed very implausible that we were going to get 500,000 out of that particular one. There are others. Are we sure that these savings are all realistic?
They've gone through a process, and all savings go through a process. They have to be looked at by the officers concerned. Finance team also look at them as well. I would agree that, and Nick as the Chief Executive has also highlighted this is going to be a very difficult budget to deliver, because we have got to that point now where, frankly, we are almost to the point of trying to get blood out of a stone. I think we've been like that for a while now. But I do believe that there are now the spending controls in place, and there are the processes in place that will improve our ability to do that. Having said that, there are no guarantees, and in a year's time I could be sat here basically apologising for the fact that we didn't deliver on those savings, but we are going to have a bloody good try at doing it because we need to, frankly.
I certainly don't want to seem unsympathetic on that, and I recognise we are facing a very difficult time as a council, as a country. I just want to make a note that if previously we have had criticism of savings not being deliverable as a council under the last administration, it's only fair to say, do we have savings here that are in the same way? It can't be, we cannot have it both ways at once. That's all I'm saying.
I fully accept that. And one of the things that we are looking at, and I think that's one of the reasons why the optimism bias has been taken away, because I think that wasn't particularly helpful in terms of ensuring that deliveries were made. I think that, but you can spend too much time looking backwards. I'm more interested in looking forwards. I think that what we now have to do is, assuming this budget is passed, we then have to start work straight away, making sure we deliver on what's in the budget. not just the savings, but also the investments that we want to make right across the council. Tom, you had your hand up?
Just wondered if they found the figures, and there was a couple more points before we move to the vote I just wanted to make.
We've been waiting to respond to that one. So just to give you the overviews, Councillor Reynard, the core spending power increase. So firstly, I'm going to just explain it because it's taken from one year to the other. So this comes from the government published core spending power tables. So the additionality, and it's not all government grants, but it's moving from one year to the other, was 39.5 million. So, but what core spending power does is it assumes that councils will increase council tax at the maximum level and business rates will be in line with the returns. So they built in assumptions. So when you get the figures kind of announced to you, it's actually built in a lot of assumptions that things will go up. However, within that, there were things that did move from the financial strategy and the assumptions when that work was done through to the actual final work in December. So Sarah's got that movement also, because there were things in our assumptions in Bristol that some things went down, some things went up. Taking an example of what went down, the assumption that government was going to fully refund councils the NI increase based on the formulas, and we're still waiting for that number, but the formulas that have been published, our assumption is that that's one that's gone down, so that's created pressure, but there are things that have been welcome also. So Sarah's going to just walk through those movements.
Yeah, so I think overall, for 25-26, our core funding improved as a result of the provisional settlement by £26.6 million against our previous assumptions in the MTFP from last February, of which the most notable in that would the 11.5 million around the recovery funding and the 7.5 million around the extended producer responsibility. But with those, we are only recognising them as one-off funding streams. So the recurrency of impact from year 2 onwards is only 6.7 million rather than that full 26.67 million.
Right, so the gross improvement was 39.5, and then with all other things considered versus where we thought we were a year ago, it's 26.67.
26.652.
26.652 million in additional funding.
Over and above the MTFP that was previously approved, yes.
Cool. Well, the difference the Labour government makes, eh? Just a couple more points to make before we move to the vote, just to explain our group's position on this budget. So, whilst we understand that this is ultimately a gateway to the next stage of the process for reasons we've outlined at various points today, we won't be voting for it to proceed, but as soon as probably the vote's in the room for it to carry. Regardless, I think we have got significant concerns around transparency, timeliness of responses to things that we have raised as well. And look, this is said from a place of constructive criticism for just like, can we just think about how we look at all this going forward? Finance budget setting process is always a very, very pressured period, and that's fully, absolutely recognised. But let's just make sure that going into future years, we do take that learning forward so we get to a place where, maybe we're more likely to support a budget depending on its content. And that brings me to my second point of why we're not supporting it today. Whilst we are pleased to see that several proposals that we had concerns about have come out, including library closures, mothballing of our museums, and also lollipop people staying, that's really good news. There still remain significant concerns for us, particularly in the adult social care space. The domestic abuse funding, whilst the project hasn't gone ahead, actually, could that not fund some extra workers to support more people in the city? And we'd hope that can be really thought through in the coming weeks. So just sort of set that out, and we're really committed to working going forwards and thinking about how we make sure we get this process more slick. It was always going to be a bit clunky the first time under a committee system, wasn't it? And I just want to restate that commitment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Blenkinsop.
It is one that's not on this particular budget, so to speak, because we've got the full closure of the Culture Investment Programme, and that's coming next year, I believe. And I just want to make that as a pipeline that is, again, something that I think the Labour group as a whole, and myself in particular, are deeply worried about. We're reliant on our status as a city of arts, media, culture, and creativity in general. I feel like this is sending some of the absolute worst messaging around Bristol that we could possibly send. I know we've got lots of financial problems, but I'm bemused as to why we would look at this as something to cut.
Councillor Stafford Townsend.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important to note that it's not about ending it and then not replacing it with something else. We are in the process of, we've got a cross-party culture working group, which we've got several members of the Labour group on. And as part of that work is looking at what our cultural strategy is going to be going forwards. So it's been deferred so that we've got enough time to work out what it's going to be. The same for the historic houses, making sure we've got enough time to consider all the other options, look at what other cities are doing, look at what meets the best need for Bristol. Is it this fund that we've been doing before, which does excellent work, but maybe not quite what we need to be doing going forward? So we're going to be looking at everything through the cross-party working group, also through the One City Culture Board as well, and then bringing forward something that really does meet the needs and finds a way to create a sustainable funding pot for the arts and culture sector, because it is, and it's great to see so many people respond to the consultation as well, with as much enthusiasm for supporting culture as the Green Group does, the Labour Group does, I know that Tony does as well. So rest assured, we are going to find a solution.
I mean, I don't wish to be too negative, and obviously, you know, we are working hard as a council. I know you are working hard. I know this is something that matters to you, and it matters to all of us. But it's that sense of review. It doesn't fill me with the greatest assurance. We have a similar thing on page 930 where we're expecting to get savings of £1.5 million from a review, and it just seems to me like this is inevitably going to be code for a reduced service, if not an outright dismantled service. I know that's not what you want. It's what I'm afraid of. And so every time that we have these kinds of reviews, I'm sort of thinking, council tax reduction scheme is another thing. I strongly suspect that none of us here, almost none of us here, want to get rid of it. But I'm still worried about it. It's still something that is, as I said, up in the air, subject to be considered.
I agree, and I would therefore invite you to join me in lobbying your party's government to give us more funding, because the funding for the arts and culture sector has been completely decimated in the last 15 years. And it's, yes, not looking at anybody in particular, but it's, because of the last government, it has been decimated. We're in a really terrible, terrible position where the sector has been defunded across the board, across the country. And what we must make sure that doesn't happen is, as we've seen in other cities where it does get completely cut. So I'll be lobbying central government, and I am ready. If you can join me with that, I'd be really appreciative. And then hopefully we get a bigger settlement that actually does support our sector.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is move the recommendations in the report. So the first part of that is to ask the Strategy and Resources Committee to note the following, and there's 8 items, so bear with me. To note the budget consultation process that was followed and feedback as outlined in Section 18 and Appendix 6. 2, that the budget consultation feedback and equality impact assessments have been taken into consideration by officers and have informed the final budget proposers. 3, the categorisation of earmarked reserves and provisions as set out in Section 15 of the main report. 4, the feedback provided by Bristol Schools Forum for Strategy and Resources Committee and Council for consideration in making final decisions on the dedicated schools budget for 2025-26 as set out in Appendix 13. 5, the gross distribution of the 25-26 dedicated schools grant, 547.8 million. So I'm just checking, I wasn't reading out the dedicated skills grant because it's only went into 2 of those. 547.8 million, which is 244.8 million is received net after deductions for application and onward administration of fund to schools and early year settings as set out in Section 9. 6, the housing revenue account revenue budget of 154 million as set out in Section 11. 7, the Section 25 statement of the Chief Finance Officer, Section 151 Officer, as set out in Section 17. And finally, any further DSG mitigation proposals for commencement in 25-26 approved by Children's and Young Persons Committee, subject to consultation where required. Can I take those items as noted? Thank you. I've now asked that the Strategy and Resources Committee delegates authority, 1, to the Director of Finance in consultation with the Chair of Strategy and Resources Committee following the 25-26 final local government finance settlement to make any adjustments that may be required to the budget report in the interim period between Strategy and Resources Committee 3rd of February 2025 and full council 25th of February 2025. Any such adjustments will then be reported to full council for noting. And 2, to the Director of Finance in consultation with the Chair of Strategy and Resources Committee to make any necessary technical adjustments may be required to the budget with transfers to and or from reserves as appropriate. Can I propose that the Strategy and Resources Committee delegates authority for those 2 items? Can I have a seconder for that, please?
Seconded.
All those in favour, please raise your hand. All those against, please raise your hand. That's passed on a vote of 6-3. We'll now move to the vote. So I'd like to move the vote that Strategy and Resources Committee recommends for onward consideration to full council, 1, the Bristol City Council levels of council tax increased by 4.99%, which includes 2% precept to support adult social care, noting the precepts of the Police and Crime Commissioner for Avon and Somerset and the Avon Fire Authority. 2, the Council's General Fund net revenue budget for the year 25-2026 as £571.139 million, and expenditure allocations as set out in Appendix 1, subject to any budget amendments properly notified to and approved by the Council in line with the Constitution. 3, to approve the reserves policy for 25-26 as set out in Appendix 14. 4, to approve the capital strategy for 25-26 to 2034-35 as set out in Appendix 2A. 5, the Council's capital budget and programme for the years 2025-6 to 2034-35, totalling £1.2 billion for the General Fund and Housing Revenue Fund, as set out in Appendix 2B. 6, the Strategic Community Infrastructure Levy allocations in Section 13 are approved. 7, the proposed Treasury Management Strategy for 25-26 in Appendix 4, incorporating the minimum revenue provision policy and the prudential indicators and limits. And finally, 8, to approve the strategy for the flexible use of capital receipts as set out in Appendix 5. Can I ask for a seconder for that motion?
Seconded.
Thank you, Caroline. All those in favour, please raise your hand. All those against, please raise your hands. That's passed 6 votes to 3. We now move on to agenda item 9, which is the dedicated SCURS grant. I'm conscious it's 3:45. Does anybody want to take a break? We'll take a 10-minute break, and if we come back at 5:02. let's carry on with the next part of the meeting. So we now move on to agenda item 9, which is the dedicated schools grant budget proposals for 25-26. This report asks the committee to determine the dedicated schools grant budget recommendations to the full council ahead of the 25th of February full council budget meeting. Again, to be clear, there are no final decisions being taken today. The budget is for full council to approve. I would like to invite Hannah Woodhouse, Executive Director of Children and Education, to introduce and outline the report. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much. And just before I start, I wanted to say thank you very much to the finance team who've been working hard to prepare this report, and so we'll be answering questions together. So I present for the DSG report, which you will have seen in many previous years, follows the same format, and refer to the recommendations at the end. It does describe the dedicated schools grant, the proposed use of the 4 component blocks within it. It summarises the January 2025 school forum reports, which are included as appendices and contains the full detail of the proposals. School forum continued the use of DSG as detailed in the forum papers at their meeting of January the 15th and supported the recommendations and proposals for the 4 blocks. The DSG forms part of the Council's overall budget setting responsibilities and is considered its own ring-fenced item in the budget proposals at full Council. In December 2024, the ESFA announced that the dedicated school grant allocations for Bristol, and as you said, our total allocation is a total of 547.785 million, composed of a schools block for mainstream schools 368.274 million. The high needs block, which covers all of the SEND provision, special schools pupil referral units, external provision, which is 97.624. Early years block, provision for 0.2-year-olds and 3 to 4-year-olds, which is 79.154. And the central school services block, which is the amount retained by the local authority to support shared services of 2.73 million. The increases in the blocks are a function of higher rates, changes in pupil numbers and the incorporation of other funding and new duties, and they're set out. I won't repeat them, they're set out in the papers, but there is an increase in every line of our DSG blocks this year. Not all of the increases in funding is new funding. So, for example, the teacher pay grant is incorporated within this for the first time, which accounts for some of the increase. The most significant percentage increases in the early years, which recognises additional new commitments arising from the expansion of the early years free entitlement to 30 hours, which came up from 15, which will take place from September 2025. Consultations took place with schools on the use of the schools block, including priorities for the funding formula, transfer of funds from the schools block into high needs growth fund, and for de-delegation. And these consultations took place during September and October. And separately, early years providers were subject to a consultation during December and January on the early years funding rates. And as I say, early years funding rates and proposals for schools block, central school services block are set out in the appendices and have been consulted on by Schools Forum and provided feedback on the 15th of January. And then the paper also considers the high needs block. So the high needs block received an increase in funding 7.41% and remains, as we know, under considerable pressure. The level of demand, which we see across Bristol as well as nationally, it does indicate that increased allocation will not cover spending at the same level at this year and does not provide sufficient funding for growth, additional needs or historic shortfalls. So it will result in an increase in the deficit in DSG in 25-26. As we know, and a matter of debate here for many months, we have transferred 0.5% of the schools block into the high needs block. We're allowed to do that, and Schools Forum have approved that. That was 1.7 million in total, and then as a result, we're forecast to reach 53 million deficit by the 31st of March 2025. And we can talk further if it's helpful, but we know that the statutory override allows us to keep DSG separate from the overall council position until March 2026. We're still waiting to hear further news about whether the statutory override will continue beyond March 2026, and we're in good company with many local authorities in that position too. DSG, as we know, is set out in a plan which is known as the DMP, Deficit Management Plan. It's constantly under review as we continue to bring forward mitigations to manage provision in different ways, so that we are able to reach an in-year balance position by 29-30. And that programme is also underpinned by the safety valve funding programme of which we are a part. So probably I don't wish to say anything more at this stage, but we're more than happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Just a couple of questions from myself to start with. The increase in early years funding, it shows it's a 42.71% increase, but my understanding that comes with additional burdens.
It comes with a requirement to provide additional hours in the early years, yeah.
And does that, I think you've already said it doesn't cover the increase, so is that the same for early years?
Okay. Well, so the increase in early years provision, so the new requirement for this year is the extension of the 0 to 2-year-olds additional 15 hours, and a large increase in the early years block is reflective of that anticipated participation from that point.
Sorry, my second question is, you mentioned about the statutory override. Obviously, that's getting closer and closer, and at the moment, if that statutory override isn't continued, and the DSG, and therefore presumably the council, will be in a very serious situation, as will many others. Have we had any indication at all from the DFE about whether they're going to extend that statutory override or provide an alternative solution?
So unless Andy wants to add anything, we have not. Formally, I mean informally, they're very, obviously they're really conscious that it's an issue for very many local authorities who are contingent on the statutory override remaining in place, but we haven't had anything formal, no.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Whippington and then Councillor Gooch.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was just looking at the deficit management plan in the budget this year, and I was going back to try and compare it to last year's budget, but it looks like at the time of last year's budget, our DSG financial position didn't include the safety valve, because we were looking at a mitigated deficit of 96 million this year, and now we're looking at a mitigated 58 million. So I'm assuming that's the safety valve making that difference.
That would be my understanding, yes. So the safety valve was agreed it was in March. So yeah, it wasn't assumed.
It didn't make it into the budget. Yeah, the February budget. Nope. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Obviously, there was some controversy around the safety valve this time last year, and there was opposition to it coming in, but I see it's in the budget. It's part of our budget for this year, so I presume we've now accepted that the safety valve is required as part of our budget until such time as something nationally changes, perhaps in that position. But I'm just wondering if we've got any contingency around the court case that's going on at the moment.
Obviously, so yes, we had a court case which took place over 3 days last week, and we're waiting to hear about the judgment that will be handed down, we suspect, between 2 and 4 weeks' time. it would be wrong to speculate on any impact as a result of that. We don't know where it will go. Will it continue to provide for children and young people across Bristol, regardless?
I think, Tim, in response to your question, because you were looking at me when you asked it, I think going to the safety valve at the moment is a bit like squeezing the toothpaste tube. Is once the toothpaste is out, it's very hard to get it back in again. We are where we are with the safety valve. Obviously, there is, as you mentioned, a court case going on. I think the DFE and others recognise that there needs to be a solution. The safety valve is the proposal that's come forward under the previous government. Whether the new government will take a different approach, I think that's what we're waiting to hear. Councillor Goots first.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, for especially the high needs, have we got a breakdown of how much of that is buying provision either privately or outside of Bristol, which would be mitigated if and when we open a new SEND school in Bristol?
So, yeah, I mean, yes, quite a significant number of the mitigations are dependent on the provision of additional places in Bristol, either special school or resource-based provision in Bristol, which will, over time, prevent children going out. We're not talking about bringing children who are currently in non-maintained provision back into Bristol, but would prevent children going out, being able to provide for them closer to home. So yes, the mitigations do rely on many assumptions around the provision of, for example, this year we're planning to provide 95 additional resource places in Bristol by September.
Right.
And then we've got another load of places coming in for the following year.
Okay, so how much is it saving this year, and how much do we still need to save on places that are outside Bristol?
So it is changing all the time. Obviously, the DMP will set out the position that stands at the moment, and in our last reported figures to the department, we will have relied, which were a couple of months ago now, will have relied on an assumption underneath that. Obviously, the number of children coming forward to require those places is changing all the time, as is our provision of places to be able to allow that. So I can provide for you the figure that was last reported,
okay,
but it is something that is changing all the time.
Yeah, it just would be good to get an idea of how much it costs these out of city placements.
Tom.
I just wanted to clarify around the statutory override, if that was right. Obviously, I'm aware that the general deadline is the 31st of March 2026, but we're on a different timeline, are we not? Or is it because of that safety valve agreement?
I think.
Sorry, Tom. So can you say that again?
So the statutory override, which I'm aware runs to 31st March next year, but does that still apply to us, given our safety valve agreement?
Yes, it would do. So the safety valve agreement doesn't make any difference to the statutory override. Will still be subject to it as in common with anyone else. What the safety valve does do is, because of the injection of additional funding into our deficit, it may mean that we're not needing the safety valve in the same way, because we don't have the deficit. We're able to balance. The projection is that we're able to balance depending on when the statutory override bites. So, but yeah, it makes safety valve makes no difference to whether we're reliant on the statutory override, but it may make a difference to whether we end up in a Section 114 territory as a result of it.
Thank you.
Andy, did you want to come in with something, or you?
No, I'd just say, I don't want to speculate on what happens with the statutory override. Just as a bit of insight from my last sort of analysis on safety valve agreements, the accumulated deficit of all councils is about 38 councils within a safety valve, about 1.6 billion of deficit. So you can think about what that could do to people's balance sheet if the statutory override gets removed across the country.
Tim.
Yeah, just for a short one, I apologise. You may have said this, but if you did, I missed it. It's great news that we're getting all those extra SEN school places online. Are we still on schedule to deliver what we were planning to deliver this time last year?
I mean, I think it's a matter of public record that we have struggled to be able to deliver the places at the time, in the time that we have needed to do. We've reported that to the Children and Young People Committee on a number of occasions. But we do have a plan to be able to deliver the original plan was to be able to deliver 95 places by September next year, and that is what we're intending to do, and we're on track at the moment to be able to do that, yeah.
Thanks. I'm sorry I haven't read all the children and young people papers on top of audit and strategy and resources and transport.
Shame on you, Councillor Whippington. I think one of the things I would comment as well is that the extra conditions that were brought in 2013-14, I think it was, were absolutely the right things to be brought in. Children needed them, and their parents and carers needed them as well. I think one of the what didn't happen was we didn't necessarily get the additional funding to allow us to deliver on those additional requirements. And what I'm conscious of is of making sure that we lobby hard for any other additional responsibilities or additional burdens that may come down, for instance, in housing, to ensure that they come with appropriate powers but also appropriate funding as well moving forward. Because I think what the DSG has demonstrated is what happens when you ask councillors to do extra but you don't provide them with the funding or resources to do it. Any more comments or questions? Okay, well in that case, so just a reminder that we are talking about whether to take this to full council. So I would like to move the motion that the Strategy and Resources Committee recommend the following proposals to full council. To approve the 2025 DSG budget, including 1, the Skurs block detailing Appendix A3. 1A is the Skurs block budget to be set at 368.274 million for 25-26 as per Table 1. B, that 1.851 million of the overall Skurs block DSG is transferred to the I Needs block. C, the basis for distributing the funding to mainstream Skurs be as set out and agreed by the Skurs Forum, Appendix A3. D, the growth fund for established Skurs expanding in September 2025 be set at 1 million, a component of the total Skurs block, or as agreed by Skurs Forum. 2, Central Skurs Services block, detailed in Appendix A2, includes 2, following the Skurs Forum agreement to approve the Central Skurs Services block budget is set at 2.733 million for 25-26. 3, the High Needs block, detail in Appendix A2. A, approve the High Needs block budget to be set at 97.624 million for 25-26 as per Appendix A2, after receiving transfers of 1.851 million from the Skurs block. 4, Early Years block, detail also in Appendix A2. A, approve the Early Years block budget be set at 79.154 million for 25-26, noting that spend and DSG income will fluctuate according to participation levels in each of the 3 Skurs terms. B, approve that funding for early years should be distributed in line with the arrangements explained in the report to Skurs Forum. 5, that the committee note A, the 25-26 DSG allocation of 547.785 million. B, and the forecast DSG expenditure in 25-26 is 574.255 million, with a forecast accumulated deficit of 58.568 million. C, Bristol Skurs Forum feedback on the 2025-2026 DSG budget that would be published separately following the meeting on 15th of January 2025, but which is in your appendices. Can I ask for a seconder for that motion?
Seconded.
Thank you. All those in favour, please raise your hands. All those against, please raise your hands. All those abstaining, please raise your hands. That's 6 votes to 0 with 3 abstentions. Thank you. Thank you, Hannah. We now move on to agenda item 10, the Housing Revenue Account Budget for 25-26. And again, this report asks the committee to determine this time the Housing Revenue Account Budget recommendations to the full Council ahead of the 25th of February full Council budget meeting. And to be clear, no final decisions are being taken today. The budget is for full Council to approve. I would like to invite John Smith, the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration, to introduce and outline the report. John.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd also like to start by thanking Andy and his colleagues, and in particular the service, for a lot of work that has gone into bringing this report together. Just in terms of the key areas, so the Strategy and Resources Committee are being sought to endorse the HRA 25-26 budget and the 5-year medium-term financial strategy. They're also being asked to endorse the proposed housing investment plan and HRA, or housing revenue account, I will refer to it, Chair, if that's right, as HRA, development programme, and also to seek various delegated authorities. And also to note that the 30-year HRA business plan has been refreshed and updated. As councillors will know, the HRA is a separate ring-fenced account which covers all the activities of the council as a landlord. The councillors were required to present a balanced budget and to meet a number of other financial tests as set out in the report. It's also worth noting that the council self-referred to the regulator of social housing in April of 2024, just after the budget for the current financial year, and the regulator delivered a regulatory judgment in July which concluded that there were serious failings in the landlord's delivery of outcomes around safety and quality standard, and significant improvement was needed. So the HRA account has been prepared with obviously that very much in mind, and it particularly prioritises building safety as you would expect. It's also worth noting that, as set out in the report, the HRA business plan has experienced significant financial pressures this year. So against all of that, I would say the paper does set out significant investments, particularly in the area of building safety. The council is also still delivering a number of new homes set out in detail in the report, and is also bringing forward proposals separately elsewhere in the budget for a programme of general fund borrowing to acquire some 75 new homes in the next financial year, which will help with temporary accommodation. Finally, the other item I would just highlight, Chair, is that the approach to disposals is set out in the report. It is intended to bring forward a disposals policy, which will be looked at in committee. It will look at initially non-residential properties, but also a limited number of residential properties. We've assumed in the report 14 properties in 25-26 residential ones, and 28 the year after. So giving a total of some 159 properties over the next 4 years. So those were just a selection of items. I'll pull out there, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. I'll open up for questions. Councillor Reynard.
So, thank you. The first thing I just wanted to check is about asset disposals, and this is the housing side of the asset disposals. So we've got 14-year one, then 28 in years 2, 3, and 4, and 5. What have you assumed for the rest of the 30-year business plan for disposals? Is that 28 a year?
I think it's 28 a year thereafter. I should have said, Chair, I've got some friends with me. So call it 28.
For residential disposals, we are assuming 28 per year through the life of the plan. For non-residential disposals, it's 24 up until 2039 and 12 thereafter.
Sorry, say that last bit again.
Sorry?
Say that last bit again, sorry.
Sorry, it's 24 non-residential disposals until 2039 and 12 per year thereafter.
Okay. So over the life of the plan, it's circa 826 council properties that will be disposed of under the current version of the 30-year business plan. I've done 30 times 28 and then minus the 14 for year one.
I think it works out at 808 or something like that.
Something like that. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, thank you. So just on that, 'cause the bit I wanted to understand was just some of the rationale that you're looking at. I'm aware as an asset disposals policy and development that will go to the Housing Delivery and Homes Committee in due course. And I just wanted to understand sort of what rationale you're applying. 'Cause I think there's been a bit of talk around quality of some of the stock and long-term voids, but that figure's 33 in here. So I just wondered what sort of assets or what sort of homes you're currently considering disposing of, how much thought have been given to that, or is it just a figure that's been put in a business plan to be worked out later?
So some initial work has been done to look at that, Councillor. It's fair to say that will be fleshed out and there'll be more detail in the policy when it comes forward. I think it's fair to say as well, as you know, that the business plan and the longer term assumptions will be reviewed probably every year in the way things are at the moment. So what the future arrangements are could change.
Thank you. I've got a few more. Is that all right? If anyone else wants to jump in, by all means. So I just wanted to check something. So in the housing development appendix was just the one I wanted to dive into, if that's okay, for a couple of questions. So appendix A3 for those that are trying to find it.
You could, if you've got it in front, you can give us the page number, could you, Councillor?
So I've got the individual PDF, so individual appendices. So that's probably not going to help you very much. But it says page 1141.
It's just a bit of
this document.
Thank you.
So one of the things that it references in current schemes through to planning and development, so it's the third table, it talks about as yet unidentified acquisitions / new, so that's within your 728 over the next 5 years. I was just curious as to what the kind of the spend profile of those 68 homes, is that assumed in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 of your MTFP? So it's a bit below Redfield, Crescent, Bishopsworth, if that helps you.
I need some help with that one.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking for the relevant section in the report. Yeah, I don't have the full pack. I only have the individual report, unfortunately.
Thank you, Councillor. I can find that.
Yes, it's that bold figure at the bottom of the page.
Right. Ah, right, okay, yeah. So is it the 68 we're looking at, or?
Yeah, 68. So just wondering, because obviously they're not identified yet, but I was just curious as to what the spend profile for your 68 is.
So, I mean, within the business plan, I'd have to go away and dig into that 68, but within the business plan as a whole, there is the assumption of 50 units per year for a 5-year period.
50 per year of acquisitions?
For acquisitions, yeah.
Okay. And then just to clarify, table 4, schemes to be reviewed and either held for longer term delivery or removed from the programme. Just to clarify, are they in the current business plan or are they out of it in terms of the assumptions you're making? So this is the ones that talks about Coombe, Westbury, Lanercost, Southmead, Sea Mills Community Centre, Latimer Close, New Street, Freshways and Hengrove Park, the later phases.
So they are currently not in the business plan.
Okay, so it's assuming we'll be not proceeding with any of those schemes or acquisitions, yeah, in some cases.
That's the current assumption, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just on voids and void turnaround times, just something I wanted to understand. We've put some questions into finance, which I know are currently being worked through. So I think we just wanted to understand a bit, like, could a one-off injection of funding in dealing with some of the voids backlogs help to get that turnaround time down for future years, accepting you'd have a sort of a higher figure in year 1? Because I think I'm just sort of thinking about sort of the data IT, and I'm aware obviously some of the pressures that there are at the moment, whether that could help really drive that down quicker, and that whether therefore we could make an improved financial assumption around those.
I'll have a go. Colleagues behind me are probably better placed. I mean, the current performance in year has not met the target, councillors, as you know. The primary reason for that is that the resources that were allocated to that, which were having some impact, were were diverted to focus on the repairs and maintenance backlog. That encouraging progress has been made in reducing that, I have to say, but though it's still at reasonably, it's not where we'd want it to be. So I think there's probably still a fair way to go, I would say, colleagues, wouldn't you, to do that? But we're acutely conscious, as I know you are, of the link between those voids turnaround times and revenue. So I think as soon as we felt able to do so, bearing in mind the other priorities, it's certainly something we'd want to look at, isn't it?
So I was just going to say it may be useful to share the target for 25-26, which is to reduce our turnaround times to 70 days, with a further 5 days reduction each year thereafter.
Yeah, so that would be your average, right? What's the major and the standard targets within that, if you know them? Sorry, I'm happy to have that after the meeting, the detail.
Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head, but I can take that away for you.
That's great. And then I just had a question on the interest cover ratio stuff, if that's all right, and then that'll largely bring me down. So I was just looking at the interest cover ratios, which is in, I think it's Appendix 1, page 1060, it says, on this document. I've got the PDFs open separately. It says that in 2025-26, the current projected ICR level, which I'm aware can fluctuate, and all of the given in terms of those tensions, is set at 1.36, which provides a comfort level of 1.425 million, which will be the revenue figure, presumably. What amount of borrowing would that allow, roughly?
1.6 million at 4.5%. That's going to be around about, some quick mental maths, it's probably going to be around about the 25 million mark.
The borrowing headroom that could be utilised.
Borrowing, yeah. It could fund borrowing. It could pay for the interest of around about 25 million worth of borrowing.
Okay.
But that's very quick off the top of my head.
No, that's fine. I'm happy to have the exacting figures afterwards. Just trying to dive into some of these bits. No, thank you. That's my questions.
Just a quick question from me, because we also borrow from the PWLB. And are we still in a situation where, because under the previous government, they put up the rate of PWLB, so I think if we borrow under the HRA, we can get a slightly lower rate than under the GF, is that correct?
Yeah, the PWLB does offer a discount rate for new build properties, which I think has been extended into the next financial year, but we would have to draw the borrowings down by partway through the year. I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's around about the summertime.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Tom?
Two more, if that's okay. Cladding removal programme. So to think about the 30-year business plan, it was originally programmed for over a 10-year period when it was originally signed off in the 2023 budget setting process. Is that still the case? Is that still the timeline, or is it going to be done over a longer period?
So we are in discussions with Homes England and with the government about an acceleration plan. So the assumption that we have got some funding in the 30-year HRI business plan, as you'll have seen, the assumption is that for the acceleration plan, which would, I think it's five-year plan, isn't it? 5 years.
Yeah, it takes us to 2029. Got to deliver by
2029. Thank you, Fiona.
2029.
The funding for that would come from government. That's the assumption that we've made, and we're in active discussion with them about it. So I think positive at the moment, but nothing confirmed.
Great. So potentially some extra funding coming nationally that'll mean you'll be able to go quicker. No, excellent. Well, fingers crossed for that. And then I've just got a general question, which is just knowing about capital project slippage and how that can be, and just confidence around delivery of capital programs and things like that. 'Cause I think I've been there before, where we've sort of signed off things that were then said, yeah, that's definitely the timelines, and then we've seen, north of the 100 million of slippage last year in the HRA capital program in the current year we're in. So I'm just kind of interested in, have you put additional controls in place? What are you doing to ensure that this is likely to be a more deliverable plan? Because I think the other thing which comes back to that interest cover ratio point is that the slippage has an impact, doesn't it? When things slip into subsequent year, that's where you can get your challenges around your interest cover ratio floor and able to change things.
Thank you. Yes, so there's two ways of answering that, Councillor. So the first one is, in terms of general approach to the capital programme, including the general fund and the HRA, and indeed other elements, including children's, we've set up a capital PMO. I think you've had a briefing on that, and audit committee, Councillor, haven't you, about how that's going to work. So the intention is that that would look at trying to improve how we manage our capital programmes in general. So that would include forecasting and regularity of forecasting. I am confident that through that and the work that the team have done on the budget this year, that we will be much closer to our forecast level in the HRA and in the other areas. I can see a councillor there who will hold me to that in future. You know, I would still expect there might be some variation in year, however, but the intention is to regularly reforecast so that, you know, we can make adjustments in year as well.
Sorry, one more question, if that's all right. It will be my last one, I promise. This may well be buried in the papers. So, stock condition surveys. The bit I was just keen... So, in the business plan, we assume a level of spend per property, don't we, based on likely maintenance needs. I was just interested in how that looks like versus a year ago. Obviously, we had the engagement with Savills, didn't we, to make assumptions, but now you've started doing some stock condition surveys. I wondered how that's informed what that level of spend, and has it increased, stayed the same, or decreased? I suspect it's probably not the latter.
We have done a number of stock condition surveys this year, as you know, and we're going to be rolling those out across the whole estate. We are expecting it to have quite a significant impact in terms of increased spend, and we're already increasing our spend in a number of areas anyway. Has it flown through yet to increase?
Yeah, it has. So there's a question that's come through on that. We've provided quite a detailed response, but you can see there is an increase in next year's budget. We expect to go further because those surveys are picking up more immediate issues, and we are starting to use that data within our planning for next year as well. So we're making sure we're sort of going to the properties where we're going to get the best bang for our buck on those.
Great. Thank you. I look forward to seeing those details once they've not made their way quite back to our group yet, but thank you.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, in that case, I'll move on to the recommendation. So I would like to move the Strategy and Resources Committee is asked to recommend the following proposal to full council. That 1, it agrees and recommends a rent and service charge increase to 2.7%, effective from April 2024 to full council, applicable to HRA dwellings, general needs accommodation, supported housing and temporary accommodation. 2, agrees and recommends the introduction of a new service charge for grounds maintenance and to approve the implementation of a service charges management fee of 15% levied against applicable service charges. 3, agrees and recommends the one-year revenue budget of 154 million for 25-26 set out in Appendix A1 to full council. 4, authorises the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration to be replaced by the Executive Director of Housing in due course, in consultation with the Chair of the Homes and Housing Delivery Committee, to increase service charges by 2.7%, with the exception of heating and water service charges, which are to be increased by 10%, and garage rents by 10%, and to approve the recalculated service charges and service charge statement based on actual costs for issue in September 2025.
Can I propose that we can read the rest and save Tony's voice as there's a page and a half more to go? Just an option.
It is an option, but having been criticised for not reading out the reports in public before, I am going to read them all out. So, agenda to continue in. 5, notes the key assumptions in the 30-year business plan and that the finance model is established within the agreed affordability principles summarised in Appendix A1, paragraph 54. 6, agrees and recommends the 5-year capital programme 2025-2026 to 2029-30 as detailed in Appendix A1 to full council. 7, agrees and recommends the termination of the current contracts for the HOA to acquire homes from Gorham at Dover Court and New Fossway. 8, approves the HIP and development programme set out in A2 and A3, subject to the following recommendations, numbers 9 to 13. 9, authorises the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration to be replaced by the Executive Director of Housing in due course, in consultation with Chair of the Homes and Housing Delivery Committee and the Section 151 officer to submit appropriate funding application, including Homes England grants for development and any over the key decision threshold, to support the HRA budget and in particular the delivery of the HIP and development programme, and if successful, to A, accept funding and agree associated grant terms and conditions, and B, utilise the funding for delivery of the projects set out in Appendices HIP and development programme, and C, where appropriate, use HRA investment plan funds and all reserves to match fund projects to maximise funding opportunities. 10, authorises the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration to be replaced by the Executive Director of Housing in due course, in consultation with Chair of the Homes and Housing Delivery Committee, to A, approve the priority of the procurement projects set out in the HIP and take all steps required to select the appropriate procurement route and to procure and award the contracts in line with the Council's procurement rules and regulations. Such authority to include decisions on matters which exceed the key decision threshold. B, to adjust, remove and or defer from within the current year's programme, including those set out in Appendix A2 and Appendix 1, any projects in order to fund the increased costs of any other project and or to accommodate other changes in the programme, subject to keeping with the approved overall budget. 11, authorises the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration to be replaced by the Executive Director of Housing in due course, in consultation with the Chair of the Homes and Housing Delivery Committee, to A, approve the priority of the development programme projects set out in Appendix A3 and take all steps required to procure and award contracts, including goods, works and professional services. B, during 25-26 to deliver the development programme capital investment plans detailed in Appendix A3, notwithstanding any individual project or contract may exceed the key decision threshold. C, agree the allocation of financial expenditure on schemes within the development programme and to authorise changes to adjust, remove and or defer schemes as required to deliver the general development proposals. Such authority to include decisions on matters which exceed the key decision threshold. D, to determine the appropriate nature and mix of tenure appropriate for each scheme. E, to identify and allocate suitable sites and properties for the development programme, including both council property and acquiring additional land or properties. 12, authorises the reallocation and rearrangement of the above delegations from the Executive Director for Growth and Regeneration to the Executive Director of Housing on appointment as required. 13, authorises the Executive Director of Growth and Regeneration to be replaced by the Executive Director of Housing in due course, in consultation with the Chair of the Homes and Housing Delivery, subject to approval by full Council, to take all steps required to terminate the current contract for the HOA to acquire homes from Gorham at Dovercourt and New Fossway. Does anybody want me to repeat that? Can I ask for a seconder for those recommendations, please?
Seconded.
Can I ask for all those in favour to raise their hands? All those against to raise their hands? That's passed 6 votes to 3. Thank you very much. We now move on to the final agenda item, which is agenda item number 11, the period 9 2024-25 finance outturn report. This report presents information and analysis to the committee on the Council's financial performance against the approved budget and its forecast use of resources for the financial year 24-25. The report also informs the committee on the delivery of planned savings in the financial year 24-25. And I'd like to invite Andy Rothery, as Director of Finance, to introduce and outline the report. Andy?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just speeding my way through the papers to get to the pack. So just first thing to note, whilst I'm getting the two key decisions up, this is an exceptional report, so there's no movement from the previously reported position, so continuation of a overspend position of £17.5 million. Work is underway to address that because it would be good to have that number worked down at outturn, but I'm mindful of where we are in the year. So the good news is that that number is staying static at this point in time. So just to also highlight there are two key decisions. So the first one is incorporation of the Disabled Facilities Grant. So this is the capital grant from government, and this isn't unusual. Generally, when you get to this point through the financial year, government award a bit more money to incorporate, which is helpful, obviously, with a couple of months to go. But it is essential money for awarding disabled facilities grants and making adaptations to homes. And then the second one is the, bear with me. There we go, is the Family Hubs, £1.7 million. So whilst this, when it was announced by government, looked like it might have been some additional funding, is a continuation of an existing programme. So this grant has very specific uses, and there are family hubs in operation in key areas of the city, and it is more of a weighting on addressing and giving support to people with mental health conditions, and so that is that is welcome also, but it is to just highlight that this is a expected and a continuation of a funding stream into the council. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments? Go on in, Tom.
Good news to see this additional funding coming in. Confident you can spend it?
With the family hubs money, yes, because it's continuation, so 25, 26 as well. So.
And the DFG?
John, any views to think?
Yes, I think the team are confident they can use it, yeah. In the time, yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, you're happy to note that this doesn't require a vote, it's for noting because the decisions have already been made. So can I ask that the committee notes, one, that there are no material changes to the forecast financial position as previously reported at Q3 P8 for 24-25. Two, note the decision to accept and spend Disabled Facilities Grant additional funding for 24-25 of £529,560. And three, note that the key decision to accept and spend up to £1,718,900, which is the provisional maximum allocation for family hubs and Start for Life funding allocation for 25-26. Can I take that items as noted? Thank you very much. And that's the end of the meeting. Thank you everyone for attending. Those of you who don't have another meeting, go and have some fun. Unfortunately, that's not me.